Dana Rhodes stood behind the counter of the officer's lounge, wiping down the espresso machine with the same methodical precision she'd used for the past 3 years. She was pouring a cappuccino when the base alarm screamed to life, red lights flashing across every wall. The SEAL captain at the counter reached for his radio, but communication lines were failing, voices crackling into static. Then Dana did something no barista should ever do. She stepped to the phone behind the counter and spoke 7 words that made every operator in the control room freeze. The captain lowered his radio, his eyes locked on her face, because only someone with field command clearance would know that emergency route. Only someone who'd been in the kind of operations that didn't exist on paper. Dana just looked at him calmly and asked if he wanted cream or black in his coffee, but the question hanging between them was much heavier than that. Who was this woman really? And what was she hiding behind that apron? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like every other morning at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Dana Rhodes arrived at 0500 hours, unlocking the officer's lounge with keys that jangled against her wrist. The building was modest, tucked between the training facilities and the administrative wing, a place where Navy SEALs and other special operations personnel grabbed coffee before briefings or after coming back from deployments that left them hollow-eyed and silent. Dana had learned not to ask questions. She'd learned that her job was to make decent coffee, keep the pastry case stocked, and be invisible in the way that service workers often become, part of the furniture, reliable and unnoticed. She was 32 years old, though most people guessed younger because of her quiet demeanor and the way she kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore plain clothes, jeans, and a black t-shirt under her apron, nothing that drew attention. Her face was pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of face that blended into crowds, and she preferred it that way. She moved through her morning routine with efficiency, grinding beans, warming the milk steamer, arranging cranberry scones and blueberry muffins in neat rows behind the glass. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and outside the windows, the California sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. By 0530, the first customers began trickling in. Lieutenant Commander Harris, who always ordered a black coffee and a plain bagel. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, who liked his espresso with 3 sugars and always thanked her with a tired smile. Ensign Walker, barely old enough to drink legally, who nervously ordered whatever was easiest. Dana knew their orders by heart, had their drinks ready before they reached the counter. She exchanged pleasantries when required, kept conversations brief and professional, and never pried into their lives, even though she could read exhaustion and stress in every line of their faces. At 0600, Captain Lorne Briggs walked in. He was new to the base, transferred in 2 weeks ago from a classified assignment overseas. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they landed on. His hair was cropped short in the military style, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of leading men through impossible situations. He'd been coming to the lounge every morning since his arrival, always ordering the same thing, a large black coffee and a protein bar from the basket near the register. He was polite but distant, the way most of the SEALs were, focused on whatever mission or training exercise consumed their thoughts. Dana handed him his coffee without a word, and he nodded his thanks, moving to a table near the window, where he pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what looked like operational reports. She turned back to the espresso machine, already preparing the next order. The morning rush would last until 0700, and then things would quiet down until the lunch crowd arrived. It was predictable routine, and Dana had built her life around routine because routine was safe. But at 0615, everything changed. The base alarm erupted without warning, a piercing wail that cut through the quiet murmur of conversation in the lounge. Red emergency lights began flashing in rhythmic pulses, casting the room in alternating shadows and crimson glare. Dana's hands stilled on the portafilter she'd been filling, and every head in the room snapped toward the nearest speaker mounted on the wall. The automated voice that followed was clipped and mechanical, announcing a communications failure in the primary operations center. Code black protocols were being initiated, which meant something serious had gone wrong with the base's communication infrastructure. Captain Briggs was on his feet instantly, his radio already in his hand. Around the room, other personnel were doing the same, reaching for phones, trying to establish contact with their units. But the radios were crackling with static, voices cutting in and out, frequency channels jumbled and overlapping. Dana could hear the frustration in the captain's voice as he tried to reach the operations center, demanding a status report that no one could provide clearly. The landline phone behind the counter began ringing, the old-fashioned kind with an actual bell that jangled urgently. Dana glanced at it, then at the chaos unfolding around her. Most people didn't even know that phone was there. It was tucked beside the industrial refrigerator, an outdated piece of equipment that probably should have been removed years ago. But Dana knew exactly what it was. She'd noticed it her first week on the job, had traced the line and realized it was a hardwired connection that bypassed the standard base network. It was an old failsafe, the kind of thing that existed in military installations built during the Cold War, back when redundancy in communications could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Captain Briggs was still struggling with his radio, barking orders that were getting lost in the static. Other officers were crowding around him, voices rising in confusion. No one was paying attention to the barista behind the counter. No one saw Dana Rhodes reach for that phone with steady hands that betrayed no hesitation. She lifted the receiver to her ear, listened for half a second to the voice on the other end, a frantic operations specialist asking for confirmation of routing protocols. And then Dana spoke. Her voice was calm, authoritative, stripped of the soft customer service tone she usually employed. Command route Tango 6, Delta fallback confirmed. Redirect primary communications through secondary junction at building 7903. Authentication code Whiskey Charlie 77 Foxtrot. The line went dead silent. Then, after a heartbeat that seemed to stretch forever, the voice on the other end responded with crisp acknowledgement. Copy that. Routing through Tango 6. Authentication confirmed. The alarm cut off mid-wail. The red light stopped flashing. Within seconds, the radios around the room crackled back to life with clear transmissions, and the emergency announcement over the speakers shifted to a calm status update confirming that communications had been restored. The entire incident had lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that time, something fundamental had shifted. Captain Briggs lowered his radio slowly. His eyes moved from the now silent speaker to the phone in Dana's hand, and then to her face. Every other person in the room was too focused on their restored communications to notice what had just happened, but Briggs had been standing close enough to hear every word she'd said. He crossed the space between them in 4 long strides, his expression unreadable. Only a field commander would know that route, he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. His eyes were searching her face, looking for something, an explanation, a crack in whatever facade she was maintaining. Dana hung up the phone with deliberate care and reached for the coffee pot. Her hands were steady as she topped off his cup, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She met his gaze without flinching, her own expression carefully neutral. "Cream or black, sir?" For a long moment, he didn't move. The tension between them was thick enough to feel. A silent standoff in the middle of a coffee shop while around them, normal operations resumed. Finally, Briggs picked up his cup, but he didn't drink from it. "I'm going to need to know who you are." "I'm the barista," Dana said simply. She turned away from him, busying herself with rearranging the pastry case that didn't need rearranging. "Your coffee's getting cold." He stood there for another few seconds, and she could feel the weight of his scrutiny like a physical thing. Then he walked back to his table, but he didn't sit down. He gathered his tablet, drained his coffee in one long swallow despite her warning about it getting cold, and left the lounge without another word. Dana watched him go through the corner of her eye, knowing that this wasn't over, knowing that she'd just made a mistake that couldn't be undone. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Dana went through the motions of her job, serving coffee, restocking supplies, wiping down tables, but her mind was elsewhere, running through calculations and contingencies. She'd stayed under the radar for 3 years, had built a quiet, anonymous life, precisely because she needed to disappear. And now, in the span of 30 seconds, she'd blown that cover to pieces because old instincts had kicked in faster than common sense. By 0800, the lounge was empty except for one young ensign who sat in the corner, absorbed in his laptop. Dana began the closing routine for the morning rush, emptying the drip trays, refilling the bean hoppers, counting the cash drawer. Her movements were automatic, muscle memory taking over while her thoughts churned. She knew what was coming. Captain Briggs wasn't going to let this go. Men like him, men who'd spent their careers in special operations, they didn't overlook anomalies. They investigated them. She was wiping down the counter when the door opened again. Dana didn't look up, assuming it was another customer, but then she heard the distinctive sound of multiple pairs of boots on the tile floor, heavy, purposeful steps. She glanced up and felt her stomach drop. Captain Briggs had returned, and he'd brought company. 2 men in civilian clothes flanked him, both wearing the kind of neutral expressions that screamed federal agents. Behind them was Commander Patricia Vance, the base's executive officer, a stern woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and a reputation for running a tight ship. This wasn't a casual visit. "Miss Rhodes," Commander Vance said, her voice formal and clipped, "we need you to come with us." The young ensign in the corner looked up, startled by the sudden official presence. Dana carefully set down the rag she'd been using, untied her apron, and folded it neatly on the counter. She didn't ask where they were taking her or why. There was no point in pretending confusion. She simply nodded and walked around the counter, following them out of the lounge while the ensign watched with wide, curious eyes. They led her across the base to an administrative building she'd never had reason to enter. Inside, the halls were quiet and utilitarian, painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed to exist nowhere but government facilities. They climbed 2 flights of stairs and entered a small conference room with a table, 6 chairs, and nothing else except a camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. Commander Vance gestured for Dana to sit, and she did, choosing the chair facing the door out of habit. The 2 civilian agents remained standing, positioning themselves near the walls. Captain Briggs sat across from her, his expression still unreadable. Commander Vance took the seat at the head of the table and opened a thin manila folder. "Miss Dana Rhodes," she began, reading from what appeared to be a personnel file. "Employed as a barista in the officers' lounge for 3 years. Prior to that, 2 years at a civilian coffee shop in San Diego. Before that, your employment history gets fuzzy." Dana didn't respond. She kept her hands folded on the table in front of her, her posture relaxed but alert. "What's interesting," Vance continued, "is that the command route you used this morning is classified information. Tango 6 is an emergency communications protocol established for use in the event of a coordinated attack or catastrophic systems failure. It was implemented 8 years ago and has only been updated 3 times since then. Access to that information is restricted to senior command staff and personnel with top-secret security clearances." She looked up from the folder, her eyes sharp. "So I'm very curious how a barista would know it." "I heard someone mention it once," Dana said quietly. "Must have stuck in my head." One of the civilian agents, a man with a shaved head and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, let out a short, humorless laugh. "You heard it once and memorized a complex routing protocol including authentication codes. That's your story?" Dana met his eyes steadily. People remember strange things under stress. Captain Briggs leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You didn't just remember it. You executed it perfectly. You knew exactly which junction to reroute through, and you provided authentication codes that changed last month. That's not something you overhear in casual conversation." The room fell silent. Dana could feel all of their eyes on her, could sense the questions piling up behind their professional facades. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Part of her had been preparing for it for 3 years, rehearsing different stories, different explanations. But now that it was here, she found she was tired of lying. "I used to work in communications," she said finally. It wasn't the full truth, but it was a start. "For whom?" Vance asked immediately. "I'd rather not say." "Miss Rhodes, you just accessed classified military protocols. This isn't a request. You need to explain yourself, or you're going to find yourself in a much less comfortable room than this one." Dana took a slow breath, weighing her options. She could stonewall, refuse to answer, and they'd dig into her background until they found what they were looking for. Or she could give them enough truth to satisfy their immediate questions and hope they didn't push deeper. "I worked for Defense Intelligence Agency," she said quietly. "Signals Intelligence Division. I was a communications analyst." That got a reaction. The 2 civilian agents exchanged glances. Commander Vance's expression sharpened with interest. Captain Briggs didn't move, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or suspicion. "When?" Vance demanded. "From 2007 to 2014. "And you left because?" "Personal reasons." The agent with the scar spoke up again. "People don't just leave the DIA because of personal reasons. They leave because they're asked to leave, or because they're running from something. I wasn't asked to leave, and I'm not running from anything. I completed my contract and chose not to renew. That's all." "1. Captain Briggs was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. 7 years in signals intelligence. That would have given you access to communication protocols across multiple agencies and branches. But you still haven't explained why you're working as a barista in a Navy lounge instead of leveraging that experience into a real career." "This is a real career," Dana said evenly, "and it's the one I chose." "Why?" The question came from Vance, and it carried genuine curiosity beneath the command authority. Dana looked down at her hands, at the calluses from years of operating espresso machines, and lifting 50-pound bags of coffee beans. Because I wanted a simple life. I wanted a job where I could show up, do my work, and go home without carrying the weight of classified briefings and threat assessments. I wanted to be anonymous. Well, you just ruined that for yourself, the scarred agent pointed out. I know. Silence settled over the room again. Vance flipped through several pages in the folder, her expression thoughtful. I'm going to need to verify your story. That means I'll be making calls to DIA personnel offices, running background checks, and pulling whatever files I can access with my clearance level. In the meantime, you're suspended from your position in the lounge. Dana nodded. She'd expected as much. And you'll be required to stay on base until we've completed our investigation. We'll arrange temporary quarters for you. I have an apartment off base. I can go home and come back when you need me. No, Vance said firmly. Until we know exactly who you are and what your presence here means, you stay where we can keep an eye on you. Non-negotiable. There was no point in arguing. Dana stood when Vance dismissed her, and one of the civilian agents, the one who hadn't spoken yet, a younger man with nervous energy and quick movements, escorted her out of the building. They walked in silence across the base to a row of temporary housing units used for visiting personnel and contractors. He unlocked one of the doors, handed her the key, and informed her that someone would bring her personal belongings from her apartment later that day. Then he left, and Dana found herself alone in a sterile room with a single bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the training grounds. She sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long, slow breath. This was bad. Not worst-case scenario bad, but close enough. She'd worked so hard to build a life that didn't involve clearances and classified operations. A life where she could sleep through the night without nightmares about intercepted communications and failed missions. And now it was all unraveling because she'd responded to an emergency the way she'd been trained to respond, without thinking, without hesitation. Hours passed. Dana watched through the window as SEAL candidates ran training drills, their shouts and the sound of gunfire from the range drifting faintly through the glass. Around 1400 hours, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find a young petty officer holding 2 duffel bags. "Your things, ma'am," he said, setting them inside the doorway. "Commander Vance says you're to report to Building 7 at 0800 tomorrow." Dana thanked him and closed the door. She unpacked slowly, hanging clothes in the narrow closet, setting her toiletries in the small bathroom. The bags contained everything essential from her apartment: clothes, books, her laptop. Someone had gone through her space. She could tell by the way things were packed, just a little too neatly, items grouped in a way she wouldn't have chosen. They'd been searching for something, evidence of who she really was, what she might be hiding. They wouldn't find much. Dana had been careful. Her apartment was as anonymous as her work persona, furnished with second-hand furniture and decorations from discount stores. No photos on the walls, no personal mementos that told a story. She'd learned long ago that the best way to disappear was to become boring, to live a life so unremarkable that no one thought to look twice. But Captain Briggs had looked twice, and now everything was in jeopardy. That night, Dana barely slept. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, and let herself remember things she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The operations center in Virginia, where she'd worked, monitoring communications across hostile territories, the green glow of computer screens and the constant stream of intercepted signals, voice traffic and data bursts, and encrypted messages that she and her team would decode and analyze. The rush of adrenaline when they identified a threat in real time, the sick feeling in her stomach when they were too late. She remembered the operation that had ended her career. Summer of 2014, a joint task force hunting a high-value target in Yemen. She'd been part of the communications support team, monitoring enemy radio traffic, providing real-time intelligence to operators in the field. The mission had gone sideways fast. Bad intel, compromised positions, and suddenly the team on the ground was taking fire from multiple directions. Dana had been the one coordinating emergency extraction, rerouting helicopters, directing air support, her voice the calm center in a storm of chaos and screaming. They'd gotten most of the team out. Most. But not all. 2 operators had died in the firefight, and 3 more had been critically wounded. Dana had stayed at her station for 16 hours straight, refusing to leave until every asset was accounted for. And when it was finally over, when the after-action reports were filed and the families were notified, she'd walked out of that operations center and known she couldn't do it anymore. The nightmares had started a month later. She'd wake up gasping, hearing the sound of gunfire and the desperate voices on the radio, seeing the casualty reports with names and faces of people she'd never met but whose lives had depended on her decisions. She'd sought counseling through official channels, But talking to a military psychiatrist meant everything went into her file, and she couldn't be honest about the weight she carried because that would have ended her career even faster. So she'd finished her contract, submitted her resignation, and disappeared into civilian life. No forwarding address to anyone except the bare minimum for tax purposes. She'd moved to San Diego because it was far from Virginia, but still had enough military presence that no one would question a veteran wanting to live nearby. She'd taken the first job she could find, coffee shop work, because it was simple and required no background checks beyond the basics. And when the position opened up at the naval base, she'd applied because the pay was better and because some part of her, the part that still missed the sense of purpose that came with serving, wanted to be close to that world, even if she couldn't be in it anymore. She'd convinced herself that she could be content on the periphery, serving coffee to warriors instead of being one herself. And for 3 years, and it had worked. Until this morning, when old instincts had overridden common sense and exposed her for what she really was. The next morning, Dana reported to Building 7 at 0800 sharp. Commander Vance was waiting in the same conference room, but this time she was alone. She gestured for Dana to sit, and when they were both settled, she slid a document across the table. "I spoke with DIA personnel offices yesterday afternoon," Vance said without preamble. "Your story checks out. Dana Rhodes, Signals Intelligence Analyst, honorable discharge after 7 years of service. Your record is impressive. Multiple commendations, including one for exceptional performance during a classified operation in 2014. Dana didn't touch the document. She kept her hands in her lap and waited. "What your record doesn't explain is why someone with your skills and clearances is wasting them on coffee service. I don't consider it wasted." Vance leaned back in her chair, studying Dana with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating personnel. "Captain Briggs thinks you're either running from something or hiding something. He's not wrong about you being an anomaly. People with your background don't just disappear into minimum wage jobs without a reason. I wasn't running or hiding. I was tired." "Of what?" "Of the weight." Dana met Vance's eyes directly. "Of knowing that every decision I made could mean life or death for people in the field. Of watching good operators get hurt or killed because intelligence was a minute too late or a mile too off target. I did my job well, Commander, but it broke something in me. So I left, and I found something that didn't break me further." Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, as if Dana had just confirmed something she'd suspected. "I understand that. More than you might think. But here's the problem, Miss Rhodes. You exposed yourself yesterday. Captain Briggs isn't the type to let mysteries go unsolved, and now you're on the radar of base security, and probably a few other agencies who are wondering what a former DIA analyst is doing, working at a naval installation under an assumed identity." "I'm not under an assumed identity. Dana Rhodes is my legal name. But you're not who you appear to be. And in the world we work in, that's the same thing." Vance pulled the document back and closed the folder. "I'm going to make you an offer. It's not an order, not yet, but I strongly suggest you consider it." Dana felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of offer?" "Captain Briggs is running a training evolution next month. Advanced communications and coordination for SEAL teams operating in contested environments. He needs someone who understands signal routing, emergency protocols, and how to manage communications under pressure. Someone who's been in the operational environment and knows how things fall apart when the shooting starts. I'm not interested in going back to that life. I'm not asking you to go back to your old life. I'm asking you to consult on a training program. 2 weeks, maybe 3. You help design scenarios. You teach these operators how to maintain communications when everything's going to hell, and then you go back to your coffee shop if that's what you want." "And if I say no?" Vance's expression hardened slightly. "Then I have to question why a former intelligence analyst is so determined to stay in a low-profile position on a military base. That raises red flags, Miss Rhodes. Red flags that lead to investigations, polygraphs, and a level of scrutiny that I don't think you want." It wasn't quite a threat, but it was close enough. Dana recognized the corner she was being backed into. If she refused, they'd dig deeper, and eventually they'd find things in her past that she'd rather keep buried. Not illegal things, but painful things. Failures and losses that she'd worked hard to move beyond. But if she agreed, she'd be stepping back into the world she'd fought so hard to escape. "How long do I have to decide?" 24 hours. Dana stood. "Then I'll give you my answer tomorrow." She left the building and walked aimlessly around the base, trying to clear her head. The morning was warm, typical Southern California weather, with a breeze coming off the ocean carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. She found herself near the beach, where SEAL trainees did their infamous Hell Week training, watching waves crash against the shore in rhythmic patterns that were both soothing and relentless. She thought about the last 3 years, the carefully constructed peace she'd built. But she also thought about the moment yesterday when she'd picked up that phone, the clarity that had come with having a purpose again, even if just for 30 seconds. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be good at something that mattered, to use skills she'd spent years developing instead of letting them atrophy while she steamed milk and arranged muffins. Maybe that was the real reason she'd applied for the job at the base lounge. Maybe some part of her had known she couldn't completely walk away, that she needed to stay close to the world she'd left behind, even if she couldn't fully re-enter it. And maybe this was an opportunity to find a middle ground, a way to use what she knew without drowning in the responsibility that had driven her away. By the time the sun was setting, painting the Pacific in shades of orange and purple, Dana had made her decision. She returned to Building 7, found Commander Vance's office, and knocked on the doorframe. Vance looked up from her desk, surprised. "I gave you 24 hours. I know, but I've already made up my mind." Dana took a breath. "I'll do it. The training program. But after it's done, I go back to my regular job, and we agree that what I did yesterday was a one-time thing. No more questions, no more investigations." Vance stood and extended her hand. "Agreed. Report to Captain Briggs tomorrow at 0900. He'll brief you on the training requirements." They shook hands, and Dana left feeling both relieved and terrified. She'd just agreed to step back into the fire she'd spent 3 years avoiding, and she had no idea if she was strong enough to handle it without getting burned again. The next morning, Dana found Captain Briggs in a classroom facility near the main training compound. The room was set up like a small tactical operations center with computers, communication equipment, and large screens mounted on the walls displaying maps and data feeds. Briggs was standing at a whiteboard covered in diagrams and notes, and he turned when she entered. "Commander Vance told me you agreed to help," he said, setting down the marker he'd been holding. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Dana admitted. She moved into the room, looking at the equipment with a critical eye. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish with this training?" Briggs gestured to the whiteboard. "Standard SEAL training covers basic communications and protocols, but when teams deploy to high-threat environments, communications infrastructure often fails, either through enemy action, equipment malfunction, or environmental factors. I want to train my operators to maintain effective command and control even when primary systems are down." Dana nodded, studying the diagrams. "You're looking at emergency routing protocols, backup systems, alternative methods of communication." "Exactly. But it's not just about knowing the protocols. It's about making those decisions under pressure, when everything's chaotic and you've got limited time. That's where you come in." He crossed his arms, leaning against the desk. "Commander Vance said you were involved in a classified operation in 2014, the one that got you a commendation. She shouldn't have told you that. She didn't give me details, just said you'd been tested under fire and performed exceptionally. That's what I need for this training. Someone who's been there, who knows what it's really like when everything goes wrong." Dana was quiet for a moment, memories threatening to surface. She pushed them back down. "What you're really asking is whether I can help your operators avoid the mistakes that get people killed." Briggs met her eyes. "Yes." She appreciated the honesty. No sugarcoating, no platitudes about how mistakes were learning opportunities. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that this training could mean the difference between life and death for the men under his command. "Okay, show me what you've got planned so far." They spent the next several hours going through Briggs' training outline. He'd designed a series of scenarios that simulated different types of communication failures, from equipment malfunctions to enemy jamming, to natural disasters knocking out infrastructure. His approach was solid, but Dana could see gaps, places where his scenarios didn't fully capture the chaos and unpredictability of real operational environments. "You're thinking too linearly," she said, pointing to one of the scenario descriptions. "You've got your operators responding to failures in sequence, one problem at a time. But that's not how it happens. In a real situation, you'll have multiple failures cascading simultaneously, equipment dying, weather deteriorating, enemy forces adapting. And on top of that, you've got human factors, fatigue, stress, fear. Your operators need to learn to manage all of that at once." Briggs frowned, considering. "You're right, but how do I simulate that level of chaos without overwhelming them to the point where the training becomes useless?" "You build it gradually. Start with single-point failures so they understand the basic protocols. Then add complexity in layers, multiple failures, time pressure, incomplete information. And you make sure they fail." She looked at him directly. Failure is where the real learning happens. They need to experience what it feels like when they make the wrong call, when people get hurt because of their decisions. That's the only way they'll internalize the lessons. Something shifted in Briggs' expression, a recognition of shared experience. You're speaking from personal experience. Dana didn't confirm or deny. She just turned back to the whiteboard and started sketching out a modified scenario structure. Briggs watched her work, and after a moment he joined her, adding his own notes and suggestions. They fell into an easy collaboration, both of them speaking the same language of tactics and operations, bouncing ideas back and forth until they had a comprehensive training program laid out. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon. Dana stepped back from the whiteboard, surveying their work with satisfaction. It was good, better than what Briggs had started with, and she felt a flicker of pride that surprised her. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed this. The intellectual challenge of designing operations, the satisfaction of using her expertise to solve complex problems. This is solid, Briggs said, taking photos of the whiteboard with his phone. When can we start implementing it? Give me a week to write up detailed scenarios and gather the equipment we'll need. Then we can run the first training block. He nodded, then hesitated, as if debating whether to say something. Finally, he spoke. I owe you an apology. When I first saw you use those protocols, I assumed you were a threat. Someone with ulterior motives. I didn't consider that you might just be someone trying to live a quiet life after serving. Dana appreciated the apology, but it didn't erase the fact that her quiet life was now permanently disrupted. It's fine. You were doing your job. Still, I made assumptions, and I pushed for an investigation that probably felt invasive and unfair. For what it's worth, I understand wanting to walk away. I've been doing this for 15 years, and there are days when I think about what it would be like to have a normal job, normal problems. Go home at the end of the day and not carry the weight of command. Why don't you? He smiled, but it was tinged with something darker. Because I'm not strong enough to leave. This work, it's all I know how to do. And maybe I'm afraid that without it, I wouldn't know who I am. Dana understood that more than she wanted to admit. She'd left, but she'd never fully escaped. She'd traded one form of service for another, staying close to the community even if she wasn't actively part of it anymore. Maybe she and Briggs weren't so different after all. Maybe they were both just trying to find ways to live with the costs of the choices they'd made. The next week passed quickly. Dana threw herself into the work, writing detailed scenario descriptions, coordinating with communications specialists to set up the training environment, testing equipment to make sure everything functioned correctly. It was demanding work, the kind that required long hours and constant attention to detail. But she found herself energized by it in a way she hadn't felt in years. She also found herself working closely with Captain Briggs, who proved to be an excellent collaborator. He respected her expertise, listened to her suggestions, and pushed back when he disagreed in ways that made their final product stronger. They developed a professional rapport based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what was at stake. The first training block began on a Monday morning. 12 SEAL operators assembled in the classroom, all of them experienced veterans with multiple deployments under their belts. Dana stood at the front of the room next to Briggs, feeling the weight of 24 eyes assessing her. She knew what they were thinking. Who was this barista who thought she could teach them anything about communications? Briggs introduced her simply as a former DIA analyst with extensive experience in signals intelligence and operational communications. He didn't elaborate, and Dana was grateful for that. She didn't need them to know her full history, just enough to establish credibility. Gentlemen, she began, her voice steady and clear. Captain Briggs brought me in because communications failures kill operators. Not sometimes, not occasionally. Every single time a team loses the ability to coordinate, call for support, or receive critical intelligence, people die. My job is to make sure you know how to prevent that, and when prevention fails, how to adapt and survive. She had their attention now. Dana spent the next hour walking them through communication theory, explaining the vulnerabilities in different systems, the ways enemy forces could disrupt signals, and the protocols designed to maintain connectivity under adverse conditions. She could see some of them getting restless, eager to move past the classroom portion and get to practical application. She understood that. Operators learned by doing, not by listening to lectures. Okay, she said, cutting her presentation short. Let's put theory into practice. Split into 3 teams of 4. Each team will be given a scenario involving communication failure. Your objective is to maintain command and control with your parent unit while completing a time-sensitive mission. Captain Briggs will be evaluating your performance. The operators moved quickly, forming teams based on their usual squad assignments. Dana distributed tablets with their scenario details while Briggs set up the communication equipment they'd be using. The scenarios were designed to be challenging but not impossible, testing their ability to think creatively when standard protocols failed. Team 1's scenario involved a hostage rescue where their primary radios were jammed by enemy electronic warfare. Team 2 had to coordinate air support during a raid when satellite communications went down. Team 3 faced a medical evacuation situation where severe weather disrupted all wireless signals. Each scenario had built-in complications that would force the operators to make difficult decisions under pressure. Dana and Briggs moved between teams, observing how they approached the problems. Some teams adapted quickly, finding alternative communication methods and establishing workarounds. Others struggled, clinging to standard procedures even when those procedures clearly weren't working. Dana made mental notes of who showed leadership, who panicked under pressure, and who demonstrated creative problem-solving. After 90 minutes, she called time and gathered everyone back in the main classroom. "Let's debrief. Team 1, walk us through your approach." The team leader, a chief petty officer named Marcus Reeves with a scar running along his jaw, stood up. "We recognized immediately that the jamming was too strong to overcome with our standard equipment. So we switched to short-range tactical signals using burst transmission. We also sent a runner back to the staging area to relay longer messages physically." "Good adaptation," Dana said, "but you lost 12 minutes making that switch. In your scenario, the hostages were being moved to a secondary location after 10 minutes. They're gone before you can reach them. What could you have done differently?" Reeves frowned, thinking, "We could have pre-positioned the runner before the jamming started." "Exactly. Always assume communications will fail and have backup plans ready to implement immediately, not after you've wasted time trying to fix the primary system." She turned to Team 2. "What about you? How did you handle the satellite failure?" Team 2 had struggled more visibly. Their leader, a younger operator named Jake Hutchins, admitted they'd spent too much time trying to restore satellite connectivity instead of finding alternatives. By the time they'd switched to high-frequency radio to call for air support, they'd missed their strike window and enemy forces had reinforced the target location. Dana didn't pull her punches. "You got people killed because you were fixated on making technology work instead of adapting to reality. When a system fails, you have seconds to pivot, not minutes. Hesitation in communications is just as deadly as hesitation pulling a trigger." The room was quiet. She could feel the tension, the resistance from operators who weren't used to being spoken to so bluntly by someone outside their command structure. But Dana didn't soften her tone. These men needed to understand that communications wasn't a support function, it was a survival skill. Team 3 had performed the best, using a combination of landline phones, relay stations, and even improvising a signal mirror to communicate with their helicopter pilots when weather knocked out all electronic options. Dana praised their creativity and their willingness to use unconventional methods. "The key lesson here," she said, addressing the full group, "is that communications is about getting information from point A to point B. The method doesn't matter. Radio, phone, messenger, smoke signals, I don't care. What matters is that critical information reaches the people who need it when they need it. Never become so dependent on technology that you forget the basics." They ran 3 more iterations over the following days, each one more complex than the last. Dana steadily increased the difficulty, adding multiple simultaneous failures, introducing enemy actions that disrupted their plans, and forcing them to operate with degraded information. Some operators thrived under the pressure. Others cracked, making poor decisions that would have resulted in mission failure and casualties. By the end of the first week, Dana had identified the strongest communicators in the group and started pushing them harder, giving them leadership roles in the scenarios and holding them accountable for team performance. She also worked individually with the operators who struggled, helping them understand where their thinking broke down under stress. Captain Briggs pulled her aside after one particularly grueling training session. "You're good at this. Better than I expected." "Thanks, I think." He smiled. "It's a compliment. These guys respect you. That's not easy to earn with this community. They've been testing you all week, pushing back on your methods, questioning your scenarios. But you've held your ground, and now they're listening." Dana hadn't consciously noticed the shift, but Briggs was right. The operators had stopped treating her like an outsider and started engaging with the training seriously, asking genuine questions and seeking her feedback. It reminded her of her time in the operations center, where she'd earned the trust of field operators by proving she understood their world and wouldn't waste their time with irrelevant information. "There's something else," Briggs said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I've been asked to brief command on the training program. They want to know if it's worth expanding to other teams, maybe making it part of standard advanced training." "What did you tell them?" "That it's valuable and that you're essential to making it work." He paused, They want to meet you. Talk about the possibility of bringing you on in a more official capacity. Dana felt her stomach drop. I agreed to help with this one training program. That's it. I know. But think about it. You've proven you're still one of the best at what you do. You could make a real difference, not just for my team, but for operators across the entire special operations community. I left that world for a reason, Captain. I know, and I'm not trying to push you back into something that hurt you, but maybe there's a middle path. Contract work, part-time consulting, something that lets you use your skills without the full weight of operational responsibility. Dana didn't answer. She walked away from the conversation feeling unsettled, the carefully constructed boundaries she'd built around her new life suddenly feeling permeable and uncertain. That night, alone in her temporary quarters, Dana allowed herself to really think about what Briggs was suggesting. For 3 years, she'd told herself she was content with simplicity, with being invisible and uninvolved. But this past week had shown her something she'd been trying to deny. She missed the work, not the trauma or the losses, but the challenge, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what she did mattered. She thought about the operators she'd been training, young men who would deploy to dangerous places and face threats most people couldn't imagine. If her knowledge and experience could help keep even one of them alive, didn't she have an obligation to share it? But at what cost to her own well-being? How much could she give before she ended up back in the dark place she'd fought so hard to escape? The second week of training focused on real-time scenario execution. Dana had arranged for the team to conduct exercises in different locations around the base, simulating field conditions as closely as possible. They ran night operations with limited visibility, exercises during simulated chemical attacks that required sealed protective gear, and scenarios where they had to establish communications in hostile territory with minimal equipment. One exercise stood out. Dana had designed a scenario where the team had to coordinate a rescue operation for a downed pilot, while simultaneously managing a complex air assault and dealing with multiple communication failures cascading at once. She'd made it deliberately overwhelming, pushing the operators past their comfort zones to see how they responded. Chief Reeves was running the command element for this scenario. Dana watched from the observation post as he tried to manage the chaos, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. Equipment was failing according to the programmed timeline Dana had created. Enemy forces, played by other base personnel, were adapting to the team's tactics. The downed pilot's emergency beacon was getting weaker, indicating he was injured and running out of time. Reeves made a critical decision. Instead of trying to manage everything himself, he delegated authority, breaking his team into smaller elements with specific objectives and empowering his subordinate leaders to make decisions without waiting for his approval. It was exactly the right call, distributing the cognitive load and allowing faster responses to developing situations. The scenario played out over 2 hours. There were mistakes and setbacks, moments when success hung by a thread, but ultimately they succeeded. The pilot was recovered, the air assault achieved its objectives, and the team extracted without casualties. When Dana called the exercise complete, she could see the exhaustion and exhilaration on every face. In the debrief, she praised their performance, but also highlighted areas for improvement. Chief Reeves, your decision to decentralize command was excellent, but you waited 15 minutes into the scenario before doing it. What made you hesitate? Reeves considered the question. Training, I guess. I'm used to maintaining tight control, making sure I know what every element is doing. Letting go felt like losing control. That's the trap leaders fall into. You think control means you have to make every decision, but real control comes from having people you trust, making good decisions faster than you could make them yourself. The best commanders empower their people and provide guidance, not micromanagement. It was a lesson Dana had learned in her own career, watching operations succeed or fail based on leadership decisions made in seconds. She could see the understanding clicking into place for several of the operators, that shift in perspective that separated adequate leaders from exceptional ones. By the time the second week ended, the training program had exceeded Captain Briggs's expectations. The operators were performing at a higher level, responding to communication challenges with creativity and confidence. More importantly, they'd internalized the mindset Dana had been trying to instill, understanding that effective communication was about adaptability and problem-solving, not just following protocols. On the final day, Commander Vance attended the closing briefing along with several other senior officers Dana didn't recognize. They watched the final exercise, a comprehensive scenario that combined everything the operators had learned over the 2 weeks. The team performed brilliantly, managing complex communication challenges with the kind of competence that came from genuine understanding rather than rote memorization. After the exercise concluded, Vance approached Dana with an expression that was difficult to read. Impressive work, Miss Rhodes. Captain Briggs wasn't exaggerating when he said you were essential to this program's success. The operators did the work. I just provided guidance. Modest and competent. Unusual combination. Vance gestured to the other officers. These are representatives from Naval Special Warfare Command. They'd like to discuss expanding this training program across multiple SEAL teams. Dana had been expecting this, but it still made her chest tighten. Commander Vance and I had an agreement. I help with this one training program, then I go back to my regular position. One of the visiting officers, a captain with silver hair and intense green eyes, stepped forward. We understand your reluctance, Miss Rhodes, but what you've developed here is too valuable to limit to one team. We're prepared to offer you a civilian contract position. You'd have flexibility in your schedule, good compensation, and you'd be doing work that saves lives. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested. The captain's expression hardened slightly. May I ask why? You clearly have the skills and experience. You've proven you can teach effectively. What's holding you back? Dana met his eyes directly. Because I left operational work for my own health and sanity. I agreed to this training program as a one-time thing, and it's been valuable, but it's also been exhausting. I can't sustain this level of involvement without falling back into patterns that nearly destroyed me before. There was silence after that admission. The visiting officers exchanged glances, clearly not having expected such blunt honesty. Finally, the captain nodded slowly. I respect that. Not many people have the self-awareness to know their limits and the courage to enforce them. The offer will remain open if you change your mind. They left shortly after, and Dana felt the tension drain from her shoulders. She'd held her ground, protected the boundaries she needed to maintain, but as she watched them walk away, she couldn't shake a small, nagging feeling of doubt. Was she doing the right thing, or was she just hiding from responsibility? Captain Briggs found her an hour later. She was cleaning up the classroom, packing away equipment and organizing training materials. He helped without being asked, and they worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before he spoke. Thank you for what you did here. I know it cost you something to step back into this world, even temporarily. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. That's what worries me. Why does that worry you? Dana set down the equipment she was holding. Because if it's not hard, if I enjoyed it, then maybe I left for the wrong reasons. Maybe I was just running away from one bad experience instead of processing it and moving forward. Briggs leaned against the desk, considering his words carefully. I think there's a difference between running away and making a strategic withdrawal. You left when you needed to, and you built a life that gave you space to heal. That doesn't mean you can never engage with this work again. It just means you needed time and distance first. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just going to keep making the same mistakes. Getting involved, getting hurt, and retreating again. That's always a risk. But it's also a risk to play it so safe that you never use the gifts you have. You're exceptional at this work, Dana. Not just competent, exceptional. And you made a real difference for those operators. They're better prepared now because of what you taught them. That has value. Dana wanted to dismiss his words, but she couldn't, because deep down, she knew he was right. The training had felt meaningful in a way serving coffee never had. She'd made an impact, used her knowledge and experience to genuinely help people who were putting their lives on the line. That mattered. I need to think about it, she said finally. Not the contract offer. They already said no to that. But what I want my life to look like going forward, whether I can find a balance between service and self-preservation. Fair enough. And for what it's worth, whatever you decide, I'm grateful you came back, even if it was just for 2 weeks. They finished cleaning up, and Dana returned to her temporary quarters. The next day, she would move back to her apartment off base, resume her position in the officers' lounge, and try to return to the quiet life she'd built. But something fundamental had shifted inside her, and she wasn't sure if she could go back to being invisible anymore. 2 days later, Dana was back behind the espresso machine in the officers' lounge. The morning rush proceeded exactly as it had for the past 3 years. Lieutenant Commander Harris with his black coffee and bagel, Chief Rodriguez with his 3-sugar espresso, the familiar rhythm of orders and small talk and the hiss of steam wands. It should have felt comfortable, like slipping back into a favorite pair of shoes. Instead, it felt constraining. She noticed Captain Briggs watching her from his usual table. He didn't approach, didn't say anything, just observed with that analytical gaze of his. Dana finished serving a customer and walked over to him. Something you need, Captain? Just wondering how it feels to be back. Strange. Everything's the same, but I'm different. He nodded as if that was the answer he'd expected. The operators from the training program have been talking about you. telling other teams about what they learned. You've developed a bit of a reputation. Dana wasn't sure how she felt about that. I'm just the barista. We both know that's not true anymore. Before she could respond, the door to the lounge opened, and Commander Vance walked in. She wasn't in uniform, which was unusual, and she approached the counter with purpose. Dana, do you have a minute? They stepped outside into the morning sunlight. Vance got straight to the point, as always. I have a problem, and I think you might be the only person who can help me solve it. Commander, if this is about the contract position again, I already said no. It's not about that. Not exactly. Vance glanced around to make sure they were alone. We've intercepted communications suggesting a potential security threat to the base. Nothing confirmed, just chatter. But the intelligence analysts are having trouble piecing together the full picture because the signals are fragmented and the enemy is using sophisticated encryption. Dana felt her pulse quicken. You need a signals intelligence analyst. I need you specifically. Because you're here, you have the clearances even if they're dormant, and you know this base's communication infrastructure better than anyone after the training program. I need someone who can analyze the intercepts, identify patterns, and tell me if this is a real threat or just noise. Commander, this is exactly the kind of thing I left the DIA to avoid. High-pressure intelligence work with lives hanging in the balance. I know, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent. Give me 48 hours. Look at the intercepts, apply your expertise, and tell me what you see. If you don't find anything actionable, we'll bring in outside analysts, and you can walk away with a clear conscience. But if there's something there, if you can see something that others are missing, you might save lives. Dana closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight settling back onto her shoulders. She'd known this was coming the moment she'd picked up that phone during the emergency. She'd known that stepping back into her old role, even briefly, would open doors she'd spent years keeping closed. But Vance was right about one thing. If there was a real threat and Dana had the skills to identify it, could she really refuse to help? 48 hours, that's all I'm committing to. Thank you. An hour later, Dana was sitting in a secure facility she hadn't known existed on the base, staring at computer screens filled with intercepted communications. The data was fragmentary, as Vance had warned. Bits of radio traffic, encrypted messages that had been partially decoded, signal patterns that suggested coordination between multiple actors. On its own, none of it was conclusive. But Dana's job had always been to find the connections that others missed, to see patterns in chaos. She started by building a timeline, mapping each intercept to its time and location of origin. Then she began analyzing the content, looking for recurring phrases, code words, or references that appeared across multiple communications. It was painstaking work that required absolute concentration, hours passing without her noticing as she dove deeper into the data. A pattern began to emerge. The communications referenced an event scheduled for the 19th, and today was the 17th. There were references to southern entry and dawn timing. The encryption style matched known patterns used by a terrorist organization that had targeted military installations in the past. None of this was definitive proof, but the cumulative weight of the evidence suggested something was being planned. Dana cross-referenced the intercept locations with maps of the surrounding area. Most of the signals had originated from the same general region south of the base, near a series of industrial warehouses. That aligned with the southern entry reference. If someone was planning an attack, they might be using those warehouses as a staging area. She pulled up satellite imagery of the warehouse district and began analyzing it for signs of unusual activity, traffic patterns, vehicles that appeared repeatedly, anything that stood out. And there it was, a delivery truck that had been photographed at 3 different warehouses over the past week, always at night. The truck belonged to a legitimate company, but its presence in that area at odd hours was suspicious. Dana documented everything she'd found and compiled it into a brief report. It wasn't conclusive evidence of an imminent attack, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. She walked down the hall to the operations center where Commander Vance was meeting with her staff. Commander, I need to show you something. They moved to a secure briefing room. Dana presented her findings methodically, walking through the intercepts, the pattern analysis, and the satellite imagery. She was careful not to overstate her conclusions, acknowledging the gaps in the intelligence while highlighting the correlations that concerned her. Vance listened intently, asking sharp questions that demonstrated her own operational experience. When Dana finished, the commander sat back in her chair, thinking, if you're right, we have less than 48 hours to identify the threat actors and determine their specific target. Yes, ma'am. What would you recommend? Dana hadn't expected that question. She'd thought her job ended with the analysis, but Vance was looking at her expectantly, waiting for her tactical assessment. Dana took a breath and let herself think like an analyst again. considering options and consequences. Increase security at all southern entry points without being obvious about it. You don't want to spook anyone into accelerating their timeline. Put surveillance on those warehouses, find out who's using them, and run a quiet background check on the delivery company. See if any employees have connections to known hostile actors. If this is real, you need to catch them in the act with enough evidence for prosecution, not just disrupt a single attempt. Good thinking. I'll coordinate with base security and local law enforcement. Vance stood, then paused. You're wasted as a barista, Dana. You know that, right? I'm beginning to realize that. Over the next 2 days, Dana found herself deeply involved in the investigation, despite her intentions to maintain distance. She continued analyzing incoming intercepts, refining her threat assessment as new information emerged. The surveillance on the warehouses revealed activity consistent with preparation for some kind of operation. Multiple individuals meeting at odd hours, equipment being moved, patterns of behavior that suggested operational planning. By the evening of the 18th, they had identified 3 suspects with ties to an extremist organization. A joint task force of federal agents, local law enforcement, and military security had them under surveillance. Dana was in the operations center when the final pieces fell into place. One of the suspects made a phone call that was intercepted in real time. Dana listened to the recording, her Arabic language skills coming back effortlessly after years of disuse. The suspect was confirming final details for an operation scheduled for dawn the next morning. The target was the base's southern gate during the shift change when security was briefly reduced. They're planning a vehicle-borne attack, Dana said, looking up from the transcript she'd been studying. The truck we identified is likely packed with explosives. They'll hit the gate during shift change, trying to maximize casualties and breach the perimeter. Commander Vance immediately began coordinating response plans. The gate would be quietly reinforced. Federal agents would move to arrest the suspects before they could launch the attack. A bomb disposal team would be standing by to secure the vehicle. It was a carefully choreographed operation that required precise timing and coordination. Dana stayed in the operations center through the night, monitoring communications and providing real-time analysis as the situation developed. Just before dawn, federal agents executed simultaneous raids on the warehouses and the suspects' residences. 3 individuals were arrested without incident. The delivery truck was located and confirmed to contain over 200 pounds of homemade explosives rigged for a devastating attack. When the operations center confirmed that all suspects were in custody and the threat was neutralized, the room erupted in relieved conversation. Dana sat quietly at her workstation, feeling the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and exhaustion that came from operational work. They'd stopped an attack that would have killed dozens of people. Her analysis had been crucial in identifying the threat early enough to prevent it. Captain Briggs appeared at her shoulder, having been brought into the operations center hours earlier. You did it again. Saved lives because you were willing to do the work that needed doing. I just analyzed data. You saw patterns that trained intelligence analysts missed. You made connections that prevented a massacre. That's not just analyzing data, Dana. That's expertise and intuition working together. Commander Vance approached, looking exhausted but satisfied. Excellent work. The base commander wants to meet with you personally to express his gratitude. There will probably be some kind of commendation. That's not necessary, ma'am. Maybe not, but it's happening anyway. You saved lives, and that deserves recognition. Vance's expression softened slightly. I also owe you an apology. I pressured you into this when you'd made it clear you wanted to step away from operational work. That wasn't fair to you. You did what you thought was necessary to protect the base. I understand that. Still, I want you to know that going forward, I won't pressure you again. What you do with your skills and experience is your choice. But I hope you'll at least consider the possibility that you can engage with this work in a way that's sustainable for you. Dana nodded, too tired to have this conversation properly. She gathered her materials and left the operations center as the sun was rising over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. She walked back to her apartment in the cool morning air, her mind churning with everything that had happened. She'd told herself for 3 years that she'd left the intelligence world because she couldn't handle the pressure, because the weight of responsibility had broken something inside her. But these past few weeks had shown her a different truth. She hadn't left because she couldn't do the work. She'd left because the work had become her entire identity, consuming her life until there was nothing else left. The question now was whether she could find a way to engage with that work on her own terms, as one part of a balanced life rather than an all-consuming obligation. Could she help train operators without drowning in their potential futures? Could she analyze intelligence without carrying the weight of every decision made based on her assessments? Could she be Dana Rhodes, the barista, who also happened to have extraordinary skills in signals intelligence, rather than trying to be one or the other exclusively. She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt like maybe she could find them. 3 days later, the base commander personally thanked Dana in a private ceremony, attended only by Commander Vance and Captain Briggs. He presented her with a civilian service medal and a letter of commendation that would go into her personnel file. He also made an informal offer for her to consider a position with the base's intelligence section. No pressure, just an open door if she ever chose to walk through it. Dana thanked him politely and said she'd think about it. She returned to the officers' lounge the next day, back to serving coffee and pastries. But something had fundamentally changed. The operators who came through knew who she was now. Word had spread about her role in stopping the attack, and they treated her with a respect that went beyond customer service courtesy. Chief Reeves stopped by one morning, several weeks after the training program had ended. He ordered his usual coffee and then lingered at the counter. "Miss Rhodes, I wanted to thank you. That training you put us through. We just got back from deployment, and we encountered exactly the kind of communication failures you warned us about. But because of what you taught us, we adapted. Everyone came home safe." Dana felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad it helped." It was more than help. It was the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. So, thank you, really. After he left, Dana stood behind the counter, staring at the espresso machine without really seeing it. This was why she'd gotten into intelligence work in the first place. To make a difference, to help keep people safe. She'd lost sight of that during her darkest times, focusing only on the failures and losses. But maybe it was time to remember the successes too. The missions that went right because someone had done their job well. Captain Briggs became a regular presence at the lounge, and their relationship evolved from professional colleagues to something approaching friendship. He respected her boundaries, never pushed her to take on more than she was comfortable with, but he also challenged her thinking and encouraged her to consider possibilities she'd dismissed. One afternoon, when the lounge was empty except for the two of them, Briggs made a suggestion. "What if you designed a comprehensive communications training program that could be taught by others? You write the curriculum, develop the scenarios, create all the materials. Then you train a cadre of instructors who can deliver it to different teams. That way your expertise gets multiplied across the entire special operations community, but you're not personally responsible for running every training session." Dana considered the idea. It was elegant in its way, allowing her to contribute without requiring constant operational involvement. She could work on the program during hours that suited her, maintain her position at the lounge for stability and income, and still make a meaningful impact. "I'd need time to do it properly, probably 6 months to develop something comprehensive." "Take the time, do it right." This could become the gold standard for communications training across all special operations forces. She agreed to think about it, and over the following weeks, she found herself sketching out ideas during slow periods at the lounge. Course outlines, scenario descriptions, training objectives, all organized into a structure that built progressively from basic concepts to advanced applications. It felt good to use her mind this way, to create something that would have lasting value. Commander Vance stopped by the lounge one morning, which was unusual enough that Dana knew something was happening. "I have news that might interest you. The FBI investigation into the prevented attack has led to a larger counter-terrorism operation. They've identified a network of cells planning similar attacks on military installations across the country. Your analysis work was instrumental in making those connections." "That's good news, Commander." "It is, and it reinforces something I've been thinking about. The military needs people like you, Dana, not necessarily in uniform or in traditional roles, but engaged, contributing. We have a lot of technical expertise, but we often lack the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that comes from years of field experience. That's what you bring." "Where are you going with this, ma'am?" Vance smiled slightly. "Nowhere you haven't already been. Captain Briggs told me about his curriculum idea. I think it's excellent, and I'd like to offer you base resources to develop it. A proper office, access to equipment and personnel, whatever you need. You could work whatever hours suit you, maintain your position here at the lounge if you want, and create something that will train operators for decades to come." It was the kind of middle path Dana had been seeking, a way to engage meaningfully without sacrificing the stability she'd built. "I'd want to start small, keep my schedule flexible, and I'd need assurance that this won't gradually expand into full-time operational work. You have my word. We set clear boundaries, put them in writing, and we stick to them. This is about leveraging your expertise in a sustainable way, not burning you out." Dana looked around the lounge, at the coffee machines and pastry cases, and the comfortable anonymity she'd hidden behind for 3 years. Then she thought about the operators she'd trained. about Chief Reeves telling her that her work had kept his team safe, about the attack that had been prevented because she'd been willing to look at intercepted communications one more time. "Okay," she said finally, "let's try it." The next 6 months were a period of careful balance. Dana continued working mornings at the lounge, then spent afternoons in a small office developing the communications training curriculum. She worked at her own pace, taking breaks when she needed them, setting boundaries around what she would and wouldn't take on. Commander Vance and Captain Briggs respected those boundaries, never pushing for more than she'd agreed to provide. The curriculum took shape slowly but steadily. Dana drew on her years of experience, on lessons learned from both successes and failures, and on insights gained from working with the SEAL operators. She created detailed scenarios with built-in flexibility so instructors could adapt them to different environments and unit needs. She developed assessment tools to measure learning outcomes. She wrote instructor guides that explained not just what to teach but why it mattered. She also began training the first group of instructors, carefully selected personnel from different special operations units who would take her curriculum and deliver it to their teams. Teaching them was different from teaching operators. She had to focus not just on the content but on effective pedagogy, helping her instructors understand how to facilitate learning rather than just lecture. One of her instructors was a young Marine captain named Jennifer Vasquez, sharp and eager and full of questions. After one training session, Vasquez lingered to talk with Dana privately. "Can I ask you something personal?" Dana nodded cautiously. "How do you do it? Balance this work with life?" "I love what I do, but sometimes it consumes everything. I look at you, and you seem to have found a way to contribute without letting it take over." "How?" Dana thought about her answer carefully. "I learned the hard way that you can't pour from an empty cup. I spent years giving everything I had to operational work, and eventually there was nothing left. I broke, so now I protect my reserves. I contribute what I can, but I also protect time for rest, for activities that have nothing to do with national security, for being a regular person with a regular life." That sounds simple, but it's not, is it? No, it's not. It requires constantly checking in with yourself, being honest about your limits, and being willing to disappoint people who want more from you than you can give. It's uncomfortable, especially in a military culture that celebrates unlimited sacrifice, but it's necessary if you want longevity in this field. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for being honest about that. Most people just tell me to tough it out or manage my time better. Time management helps, but it's not the whole answer. You also have to manage your emotional and psychological reserves. That's harder and more important." By the end of 6 months, the curriculum was complete. Dana had trained 12 instructors who were ready to deliver the program to their units. A pilot implementation was scheduled to begin across 3 different SEAL teams, with plans to expand to other special operations forces if the results were positive. The night before the official launch, Captain Briggs took Dana to dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. It was the first time they'd socialized outside the base, and Dana felt oddly nervous about the shift in their relationship. "This is a significant accomplishment," Briggs said, raising his glass in a toast. "You've created something that will impact thousands of operators over the coming years. That's legacy work, Dana." She clinked her glass against his. "I had a lot of help, and it wouldn't have happened without you pushing me to find a sustainable way to contribute." "I didn't push. I just held up a mirror so you could see possibilities you'd convinced yourself didn't exist." He set down his glass and leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something? That morning when the alarm went off, when you picked up that phone, what were you thinking?" Dana smiled, remembering that moment of clarity. "I wasn't thinking. That's the point. My training kicked in before my brain could catch up and remind me of all the reasons I shouldn't get involved. Maybe that was the universe telling me I wasn't as done with this work as I thought I was. Or maybe it was you telling yourself the same thing." They talked late into the evening about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing easily between operational experiences and personal stories. Dana realized she'd been so focused on protecting herself from the weight of the work that she'd also isolated herself from the connections that made it bearable. Friendships, mentorship, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. These things weren't weaknesses or distractions. They were essential parts of a sustainable life in this field. When Briggs drove her home that night, he paused before she got out of the car. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you've already succeeded. You came back from a dark place, you rebuilt yourself, and then you found the courage to engage again on your own terms. That takes incredible strength." "Thank you, Lorne." It was the first time she'd used his first name, and it felt right. An acknowledgement that they'd moved beyond strictly professional boundaries into genuine friendship. "And Dana, the door's always open if you want to take on more, but it's equally okay if you don't. You've already given more than enough." She climbed out of the car and watched him drive away, then stood for a moment, looking up at the stars visible above the city lights. For 3 years, she'd believed that leaving operational work was the only way to save herself. But she'd been wrong. The answer wasn't complete withdrawal or total immersion. It was finding the balance point where she could contribute meaningfully while also preserving the parts of herself that made life worth living. The next morning, Dana was back behind the espresso machine at 0500 hours, starting her shift exactly as she had for the past 3 years. But when the operators came through, she no longer felt invisible. They greeted her by name, asked her opinions on tactical problems, treated her as one of their own. And when Captain Briggs walked in at 0600 for his usual black coffee, she had it ready and waiting. "Busy day ahead?" she asked, sliding the cup across the counter. "Briefing with the Admiral about the training program. He wants to discuss expansion plans. Tell him I'm available for consultation, but my mornings belong to coffee service." Briggs grinned. "I'll make sure he understands that's non-negotiable." As he walked away, Dana turned to the next customer, a young ensign who nervously ordered a complicated drink. She made it with the same care and attention she'd always brought to her work, finding satisfaction in the simple task done well. Because that was part of who she was too, not just the analyst or the instructor, but also the barista who made good coffee and created small moments of normalcy for people carrying heavy burdens. Later that afternoon, Dana sat in her small office reviewing feedback from the first week of curriculum implementation. The results were exceeding expectations. Operators were responding well to the training, retention rates were high, and the instructors were reporting increased confidence in their team's communication capabilities. She compiled the data into a report for Commander Vance, adding her own observations and recommendations for future iterations. As she worked, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the years of operational stress that had nearly broken her, the decision to walk away and rebuild in obscurity, the morning when instinct had overridden caution and exposed her true capabilities, the reluctant return to work she'd tried to leave behind, and finally, the discovery that she didn't have to choose between serving and surviving. She could do both, if she was intentional about protecting her boundaries while still engaging meaningfully. There would be challenges ahead, days when the work felt too heavy, moments when old nightmares resurfaced, times when she'd have to choose between what others wanted from her and what she could sustainably give. But she had tools now for managing those challenges, and more importantly, she had people who understood and supported her choices. Dana finished her report and sent it to Commander Vance, then locked her office and walked back toward her apartment as the California sun began its descent toward the Pacific. Tomorrow she'd be back at the lounge at 0500, making coffee for tired SEALs returning from deployment. In the afternoon, she'd work on the advanced module she was developing for her curriculum. And somewhere in between, she'd find time to be just Dana, not the analyst or the instructor or the barista, but simply herself. She'd spent 3 years believing that being the barista at the officers' lounge meant being invisible, unremarkable, safe. But she'd learned that safety wasn't about hiding who you were. It was about knowing who you were, accepting all the complicated parts, and building a life that honored both your capabilities and your limitations. She was all of these things at once, the quiet barista who served coffee with steady hands, the skilled analyst who saw patterns in chaos, the experienced instructor who helped operators survive impossible situations, and the woman who'd survived her own impossible situation and come out stronger on the other side. The alarm that had shattered her carefully constructed anonymity hadn't ruined her life. It had opened a door she'd thought was permanently closed, showing her that return was possible, that engagement didn't have to mean destruction, and that serving coffee and saving lives weren't mutually exclusive identities. They were just different expressions of the same fundamental desire to contribute, to matter, to make the small corner of the world within her reach a little bit better. And as she unlocked her apartment door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of her home, Dana Rhodes smiled, knowing that tomorrow she'd wake up and do it all again, not because she had to, but because she'd finally figured out how to want to. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her capabilities. She was simply living, fully and authentically, as exactly who she was meant to be. The barista at the officers' lounge, who also happened to know command codes that could save lives, and that was enough.